When World War II commenced, the Third Reich's military apparatus secured stunning and rapid triumphs. The renowned Blitzkrieg, or swift warfare strategy, enabled Germany to progress overwhelmingly, with none capable of stopping the Wehrmacht's advance. Before long, Polish, Luxembourg, Dutch, and French territories fell under occupation, joining Czechoslovakia, which had already been seized prior to the conflict's outbreak. Few experiences prove more degrading and traumatic for a nation's population than submission to an occupying force. Within this framework, German invaders and residents of conquered lands were compelled to coexist. Those who collaborated possessed varying motives for offering assistance to the adversary. Some acted from desperate necessity, others to survive as best they could throughout the occupation, while still others simply harbored sympathy for Nazi and fascist ideologies. Yet, when Allied forces arrived at Normandy on June 6, 1944, and as occupied regions gained freedom, retribution against those who aided the enemy became nearly integral to the liberation festivities. A complicated mixture of animosity, bitterness, frustrations, and vengeful desires unleashed punishments that numerous people deemed brutal and disproportionate. This represented vigilante justice more reminiscent of medieval periods than the 20th century. Consequently, recollections of anguish and disgrace have surfaced from experiencing romantic encounters with German adversaries during World War II. Women who had shared intimate quarters with Germans, or even those who merely socialized with them, faced accusations of what became known as horizontal collaboration. They were subsequently dragged onto streets, degraded, and publicly tormented through the historically most common female punishment practice, head shearing. The feminine form became a powerful symbol of national identity and belonging, territory upon which enemies inflicted dehumanizing brutality to demonstrate their masculinity and dominance over the female sex. Head shearing transformed into an intensely symbolic act of reclaiming the feminine form, representing specifically the deliberate removal of womanhood. In practice, their bodies became ritualistic battlefields, terrain for victors' triumphant processions, messages conveyed from males to other males, vivid evidence of conquest for some and defeat for others. Survival constitutes a framework we must invoke to interpret women's wartime behavior. Additionally, we must not minimize that some exploited occupying forces' presence to their benefit. Some established connections to enrich themselves, securing economic advantages during periods of severe shortage and extreme hardship for entire populations. Others served as professional informants who sympathized with Nazi fascist principles, women who sought to insert themselves into power structures, or perhaps simply to avenge mistreatment suffered by their countrymen before the war. Some, despite being engaged or married, were forced to support families when men departed for battle lines and found themselves tragically compelled to surrender to foreign enemies or engage in prostitution. In France, women who collaborated with Germans faced accusations of horizontal collaboration, terminology created to indicate all sexual, intimate, or romantic relationships formed with occupiers during wartime. Collaborating meant denationalizing, consciously abandoning one's national identity for that of a despised Nazi, thereby committing treason. Various historians provide examples of what constituted collaborationism, maintaining continuous and close associations with Germans, working in their service, welcoming them at your dining table, eating, drinking, laughing with them, strolling in their company. In an era of globalized history, comparative approaches must be employed to transcend classical national analyses and unite different European contexts where the practice of punishing collaborating women occurred, with head shearing being the punishment, if not the sole one, certainly the most conspicuous. During wartime, approximately 20,000 French women underwent shearing within national boundaries. However, punishments for collaborating women also occurred in nations like Belgium, the Netherlands, and Italy during liberation of occupied territories between 1943 and 1945. Throughout World War II, women who established relationships with enemies were considered unfaithful regardless of whether they had slept with them, making them liable to be shaved bald, stripped naked, and exposed to humiliation in public squares. The crowd's presence becomes essential for punishment to achieve its intended objective. Marking swastikas and inscribing phrases like German prostitute and similar epithets symbolized destruction of the guilty body. That body ceases to be sacred, so the shaved woman is prohibited from covering feminine attributes with that tortured form reflecting internal moral ugliness. The transgression committed by collaborating women is not so much against written law or regulation, but rather an offense to morality shared by the people. Hair shearing represents an archaic practice revived multiple times throughout history during political and military crises. At World War II's conclusion, shearing occurred in all countries that endured German occupation. Beginning with Allied landings in Normandy, punishment spread to France and Italy, but Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Yugoslavia, Poland, and Czechoslovakia also experienced their variations. Through photographs, collaborators with shaved heads became etched into public memory of those years. The woman who epitomized shearing par excellence in France was Simone Tussaud. In a photograph captured by photojournalist Robert Capa on August 16, 1944, we observe the young woman shaved and marked with a swastika on her forehead, harassed by surrounding crowds as she embraces a newborn infant, one of the shame children, or Nazi children, witnesses to disgrace. The image appeared in American magazine Life the following month and was subsequently reproduced in countless newspapers. The shaven woman of Chartres soon achieved worldwide fame. Tussaud was 23 at the time, and during German occupation she worked as an employee in the German occupier's interpreter office. Simone sympathized with Jacques Doriot's French Popular Party, the closest to Nazis, but her primary fault was having a relationship with a German soldier with whom she had a daughter. The soldier's name was Erich Gauss, then 32 years old. Gauss was in love with Simone and intended to marry her, but history separated them. He was sent to the Russian front while Simone would serve 26 months in prison. The shaven women ultimately became symbols of rediscovered virility and highlighted relationships between women and men who, humiliated in war, could not protect their country. In 1868, American activist and leader of early feminist movements for women's emancipation, Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote, "The male element represents a destructive, resolute, selfish, excessive force, lover of war, violence, conquest, and greed, which generates discord, disorder, disease, and death in both material and spiritual worlds." Look at the blood and cruelty displayed on history's pages. There is no need to recall that Europe's liberation was a complex period on human levels. Feelings of joy and enthusiasm, on one hand, mixed with fear and sadness on the other. Also, to cement this collective joy, populations vented against women who had relationships with German soldiers, highlighting humanity's darkest aspects, an instrument of revenge, if you will, to retaliate against those who had made themselves known in public places during war in affectionate attitudes with enemies. Indeed, during war, showing oneself in enemy company broke boundaries between public and private, transforming intimate relationships into political acts. Sexual relations, therefore, are not displayed but are scandalous. In reality, most of these women experienced these relationships as acts of carelessness or even recklessness. In the Netherlands, they were known as moffenmeisjes, women associated with enemies. In Belgium as moffenheren, German prostitutes. In France as femmes maus, Nazi women. These terms were all equally derogatory. Displaying shaved hair publicly became an act of ridicule and mockery before populations. Shaving women required careful execution and organization. While shearing before liberation was carried out secretly, at war's end, collaborators were taken to public places and exposed to crowds. This organizational and methodical aspect gave events an almost official character. Often groups of armed men violently pulled victims from their homes before populations. Victims' bodies were subjected to humiliating acts, head shaving, sometimes marked with swastikas, bodies covered with tear and feathers. Women were forced to walk naked through urban center streets where they were mocked. Some were beaten or stoned, and in worst cases, executed. The same procedure was carried out in villages scattered across different territories. The direct judge was first and foremost the people, composed of resistance fighters but also ordinary people, women, men, children, and elderly who accompanied those who cut their hair. Coco Chanel case. Fashion and controversy in the Nazi era. The famous designer Coco Chanel also had a significant stain on her impeccable suit. She established very intimate relations with German secret agent and Hitler's confidant at the German embassy in Paris, Baron Hans Günther von Dinklage, even before the war, and she did not hesitate to continue them during occupation. They lived together in a luxurious suite at the Ritz Hotel, and it is suspected that Coco even worked as a German spy. She did not regret having committed herself to the Germans. On the contrary, it gave her many benefits. The Jewish Wertheimer family owned 90% of Chanel's perfume rights. Without their financial contribution, Coco would never have started production. Therefore, the Aryanization laws fitted perfectly with her interests. Not only did the Wertheimers flee France, but with help from her Nazi cronies, Coco acquired the entire business for herself, despite the Wertheimers previously transferring their share to their non-Jewish friends. How did Coco fare after France's liberation? She knew very well how to handle herself. With her lover von Dinklage, she traveled to neutral Switzerland and stayed there to be safe until 1954. Only then did she set out to resurrect her brand. Surprisingly, it was the Wertheimers who supported her financially. Enemy love. Italian women caught in bonds with German enemies. The 2-year period from 1943 to 1945 in Italy was filled with tensions, exacerbations, attitudes, and individual choices that marked men and women on both sides, fascists and anti-fascists. Thus, we reached war's final stages with heavy emotional and psychological burdens that perhaps partly help understand violence that erupted at liberation time. The enraged people decided to take revenge, judge, and punish those who had caused so much pain in over 20 years of dictatorship and eradicate fascism's evil from Italian society. Acts of revenge are remembered in testimonies as necessary, almost as if they were national cleansing from which rebirth of a country tormented too long by war could emerge. However, even in this context of collective atonement, reflection on those unjust practices to which women accused of collaborationism were subjected cannot be missing. Cases collected in Italy over the years are insufficient to quantify the phenomenon or allow conclusive analysis, but they acquire significant historiographical value as exemplary testimonies documenting women's shearing as a consolidated practice. The phenomenon in Italy, as in France and other war-involved territories, was complex and diversified, and did not only affect the insurrectional phase, but lasted at least until the end of 1945. Furthermore, head-shaving victims were not only Republican fascists with precise and detailed faults, but women were also punished for merely being wives, girlfriends, mothers of Republican fascists, lovers of Republican fascists, and German or American soldiers. It is worth noting the complexity of the situation experienced in Italy during those years. Mussolini had exercised power from 1922 until July 25, 1943, the day fascism's fall occurred. From then on, vendettas against women began, often regardless of whether they had been fascism militants, but simply for being related to one of them. Many had been harboring fascism hatred for over 20 years. On the other hand, from that moment, Germans went from being Italy's allies to being their enemies. King Victor Emmanuel III appointed Marshal Pietro Badoglio as the new head of government. But Italy would be occupied by Germans until American liberation. Americans would also be considered by many as an occupying army. Fascism's end was not the end of a few years of foreign enemy occupation, but the end of over 20 years of tyranny. There was much anger and great thirst for revenge. In this sense, it is appropriate and necessary to explain that barbaric and archaic shearing punishment often results in a useful gesture to channel anger and avoid more serious acts of violence by people clamoring for vengeful actions. An example of this is a ruling by the Bergamo court which, in the trial against a partisan initiated by an actress whose hair had been violently cut, acquitted the accused, stating that the haircut was necessary in the interest of public order and the same interest of the poor wretches, objects of popular hatred. For judges, shaving represented the lesser evil, being an outrageous act but one that exhausted the entire penalty, without affecting any inalienable or imprescriptible rights, such as the right to life or even fair integrity of the person. Lida Barova, the woman who enchanted Joseph Goebbels in Nazi Germany. From cherished and highly coveted film star to betrayer later exiled and forgotten, a second-rate actress, mediocre in her performances but charming and beautiful like no other. A devotee of power circles, a victim of turbulent eras. This was Lida Barova, who passed away at age 86 in 2000. Born Ludmila Babkova, the actress was the offspring of a municipal clerk and an opera vocalist. Both her mother and her sister Zorka endured a particular form of neurosis that apparently had appeared previously in other family members, and which is said to have influenced Barova to a lesser extent as well. Both sisters established their careers in the entertainment industry, Zorka possessing greater maturity and intellectual development, and according to contemporary critics, superior talent, saw her career affected by her illness and ultimately took her own life. Lida Barova, conversely, after a brief stint at the Prague Academy of Dramatic Arts, rapidly ascended in the cinematic world. Her debut film was Fallen Patriots, directed by Miroslav Josef Krnansky in 1932, when the then Babkova was merely 18 years old. Following her debut and until 1934, she appeared in 19 feature films in Czechoslovakia, progressively gaining greater recognition and becoming an icon of Czechoslovak pre-war cinema. Her reputation soon extended internationally, and indeed the success of Barcarolle, filmed in 1935, earned her some attention in the United States, and even an invitation to work in Hollywood. Barva, however, preferred to continue her career closer to her homeland. In 1936, she relocated to Nazi Germany, contracted by UFA, the Third Reich's most significant film studio. There, among romantic escapades involving actor Gustav Fröhlich, she encountered Nazi propaganda minister and Hitler's right-hand man, Joseph Goebbels, with whom she also initiated an affair. The relationship could have remained a fleeting liaison, but the Czech's charm penetrated powerfully into the Nazi leader's heart. In subsequent statements and memoirs, Barva claimed to have been a victim of her own innocence and to have acted in a completely apolitical manner. The fact remains that proximity to German power circles benefited her personally and professionally. Even Adolf Hitler, known to be a cinema enthusiast, requested to meet her personally and even offered her German citizenship. During this period, Barva was identified with the Nazi regime, a perception that would cost her dearly later on, but of which she was likely unaware. The tense atmosphere around Barva began with her relationship with Goebbels from 1936, and as the relationship developed, the political tension grew stronger. This relationship was so intense that it evolved into a political problem that Hitler himself eventually had to resolve. Goebbels was known for his constant flirtations and affairs with young actresses, but in this case, the relationship with Barova exceeded the expectations of his closest allies. The minister even presented his resignation to Hitler with the intention of departing for Japan as an ambassador with his lover and starting a new life. The Führer decided to intervene and expel the Czech actress from Germany. Goebbels' wife Magda also intervened decisively, and it is also necessary to realize that it was precisely at the time when the Munich Agreement was being signed, handing part of Czechoslovakia to Germany. Hitler could not afford to lose Joseph Goebbels at that crucial moment, much less allow the international press to report on an affair between his propaganda minister and a Czech actress. So they sent her back to her country. During this period, Barva acted in 7 German-language films, speaking the language without an accent, some of them subtly propagandistic of Reich ideology, such as Patrioten from 1937, in which she played a French woman hiding a German spy in her house with whom she eventually falls in love. When Lida Barova returned to her homeland, it had been transformed into a diminished puppet state controlled by the Nazis called the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. While she was prohibited from filming in Germany, there were initially no obstacles to her return to the set in Prague, and she actively participated in the country's film production. In many ways, Barva reproduced in Prague the same social lifestyle she had enjoyed in Berlin, maintaining contacts and romantic relationships with the power elite, now composed of German officials and Czech collaborators. Again, her name brought a strong taste of betrayal. Her supposed innocence was rather cold calculation because in Germany she had become accustomed to a certain standard of living, a social standard to be exact, and here she began to take advantage of the opportunities that arose. It is admirable that when the protectorate was declared, Barova already had extensive contacts with high-ranking officials. For example, she was known for her good disposition with Karl Hermann Frank, who held various power positions in the protectorate and was sentenced to death in 1946 for war crimes. The actress promised Frank to remove the Czech suffix from her surname and call herself simply Barova to continue acting in German films. Engaging in collaborationism kept her afloat, but could not avoid some decline when, due to the war, national film production decreased precisely because of the lack of demand. In the Barrandov studios, Barova secured several theater roles for the first time, performing on several occasions on the national theater stage, although with mixed results. It is difficult to trace her theatrical career. She toured several stages, and her arrival at the National Theatre represented the peak of this facet of Barova. Contemporary reviews suggest she was generally well received, but her performance was not fascinating or professional enough for theater companies to fight over her. In Carl Journey's company, she acted as a substitute for her sister Zorka, who had more stage talent than she did. She simply was not made for the theater. The increasing lack of opportunities in the Protectorate and the final prohibition on Barova acting in any Czech film led her in 1943 to seek fortune in Mussolini's Italy. During this initial Italian period, Barova left her mark on the country's cinematography through 6 films shot between 1942 and 1944, again demonstrating her gift for languages. As Jitny states, I have had the opportunity to see 3 of these films. The first, La Fornarina, is of average quality in her career and is based like the others on Lida Barova's acting in all her beauty. It is not a great performance, but it is admirable how well she spoke Italian and also without an accent. Finally, the course of the war made the Allies advance to Italy, opening a new front. Film production stopped, and Lida Barova had to return to Prague. Lida Barova's memoir book is called Escapes, and Not by Chance. Shortly after returning to the Protectorate, World War II reached its final moments, and the power foundations that had supported the actress's career began to crumble. Fearing what might happen to her in a Prague, returned to Czech hands, Barova fled to Germany. She fled by car with actor Hans Albers, loaded everything that fit in the car, and headed to Bavaria. In the end, after a series of coincidences and circumstances, she fell into the hands of the Americans and finally decided to simulate a mental illness and was admitted to a psychiatric sanatorium in Munich. In September 1945, she was requested from Prague and immediately imprisoned in the Czechoslovak capital, awaiting trial. Curiously, the charges did not relate to her romantic relations with Nazi leaders like Goebbels, but stemmed from a spying accusation launched by her former friend and collaborator, theater director Bohumil Perník. Involved during the Protectorate in a fraud crime, Perník had been sent to prison partly thanks to Barova's testimony, and now the complaint very likely stemmed from a desire for revenge. Barova was declared innocent and released in December 1946. Due to her involvement in the German film industry during the occupation, she was banned for life from filming in Czechoslovakia and was fined, resulting in the confiscation of the villa the actress owned in Prague. The former film star still faced many twists and turns. Shortly after leaving prison, she married Jan Kopecki, a puppet theater owner and nephew of the communist interior minister, possibly also due to the favorable treatment Barova received for her collaborationist past. After a couple of years working with her husband as a puppeteer, the couple emigrated in 1948, the year of the communist regime's advent, to Austria. In this new life as an exile, Barova resided in Argentina, Spain, and Italy, managing to continue her acting career with the same or greater brilliance as in the interwar period. She managed to make a mark in 5 Italian films and Spanish films, and that is admirable, adding another language to her repertoire, and appeared on theater stages in Austria and several times in Germany. It can be said that her artistic life began after the war. In the 1950s in Spanish, Barova shot 7 films in just 2 years, between 1956 and 1957. In 1956, she divorced Kopecki, and in 1970, married gynecologist Kurt Lundvall, who, however, died barely 3 years after the wedding. In the 1960s, her career stagnated, and she disappeared from the film world except for a small role in Rainer Werner Fassbinder's film The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant. In 1999, she was one of the interviewees in the documentary Hitler's Women, in what was her last appearance on the big screen. Lida Barova died in 2000 in Salzburg at the age of 85. An anecdote about propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. When it came time towards the end of the war, when he thought it appropriate to burn all his private documents, his aide von Oven would remember that the minister was looking at a collection of old photographs. He suddenly stopped at one and showed the young man the portrait of a woman. "Look," he said, "this is a beautiful woman." Von Oven looked at the photograph. It was of Lida Barova. Goebbels stared at the face in the photograph for a few moments, and then tore the photo with his hands to the fire. "With her," he said. "Descendants of Nazis, children of collaborators in Belgium and the Netherlands? During World War II, thousands of children were born in Belgium due to relationships between Wehrmacht soldiers and local women. They were called war children, in the literal sense of the term, because their parents would not have met had it not been for the war. Most of the children born during the war were conceived with involuntary relationships, if not real loves. Unlike World War I, when German troops terrorized the civilian population, the Wehrmacht had strict orders to behave courteously towards women. Rapes were rare and even punished. During the war, German soldiers were not allowed to marry women from occupied countries with whom they had affairs. Therefore, the companions, prevented from becoming legitimate wives, found themselves alone, often pregnant, in the midst of shame and social isolation. Some chose to abandon their secret children in orphanages or put them up for adoption, hoping to regain a normal existence and perhaps hoping for a life away from the social stigma for their children. Others decided to keep them despite the difficulties and sufferings that were not spared, and despite their capacity to sustain their children continuously being questioned. During childhood, mothers tended not to tell their children about their German ancestry, answering the questions that the children often asked, also driven by the curiosity or malice of their peers, meant renewing the sense of shame and admitting faults they did not have. Most of them only discovered their paternal origins at an older age. Some managed to meet their fathers, while others did not even have the chance to meet their biological mothers. Historical research in the Netherlands states that over 140,000 girls and women came into contact with the German occupier between 1940 and 1945. It is estimated that between 13,000 and 15,000 children were born from these relationships, children whose lives have been marked by a war they barely experienced, but which often made them targets of harassment, rejection, and social marginalization. As being an illegitimate child at that time entailed a series of bureaucratic complications that made even finding a job and earning a living difficult. For their mothers, derogatorily called Muffenmeisjes, German girls, the liberation of the country occupied by the Germans was not exactly a relief. Some were tried and sentenced to prison terms or house arrest. Others were sent to labor camps along with other traitors, and others managed to escape abroad with the child born from the relationship. The case of Monica Dierickx. Between Germany and Belgium in wartime, she was born in Germany to a Dutch mother and a German father. Her father had returned severely wounded from the war. He had lost both eyes, so the family lived those early years with her paternal grandparents in Germany. In 1947, Monica's father Alois died while still very young, so Monica and her mother returned to the Netherlands. It took 3 days of travel to cross war-torn and bombed-out Germany and reach her mother's country. However, as soon as they reached the border, new problems arose due to Monica's German paternity, which was not well received in the Netherlands. Despite this, mother and daughter managed to cross the border legally and reached Amsterdam. Here, Monica's mother remarried a Dutchman and put an end to her past. For several years, Monica spent her vacations with her grandparents and paternal aunt until her past became too heavy for a girl. Despite enormous efforts to hide her German origins, she was bullied at school, and questions about her father became increasingly insistent. Monica had no choice but to resign herself to silence, preserving her mental well-being and serenity. In 2006, she decided to publish the book Anyone Being Shaved Must Keep Still, an investigation into women who had had romantic relationships with Germans during the war and the children born from those relationships. In 2012, she wrote her autobiography, Memories of a German Girl, in which she talks about the discrimination and social rejection she had to fight all her life in the Netherlands. Dierickx's testimony is accompanied by those of other children of the enemy. Dramatic and emotionally charged stories finally emerge from oblivion, and a picture different from the common imagination of the time appears. The cruel and murderous German disappears, and a friendly, kind, and seductive enemy takes his place. In the stories of this book, we recognize many children of enemies and even lost loves. Forbidden love stories, hindered by families and marginalized by society, resurface with new dignity. The question Dierickx poses to the reader is, why are the children of the enemies considered co-culprits of the war? Galinda Sweldens. Between two worlds in times of conflict, a Francophone citizen, daughter of a Flemish mother and a German soldier. Her search for the truth intensified in 2007 when her elderly mother revealed her biological father's name, Karl. In her autobiographical book, The Cuckoo Child, Begotten by the Enemy, 1940 to 1945, the author recounts how her grandparents were frightened by the fact that their granddaughter was the daughter of a German. Indeed, her maternal grandparents were from Leuven and had lived through the First World War firsthand, with the devastation of cities by the occupiers. They had seen how the children of women raped by enemies were treated and were terribly worried about their daughters and her baby's future. The book collects the stories of about 70 Belgian war children who, for the first time, tell their lives and the marginalization they suffered. It also emerges that many of them idealized their biological father, hoping he would take them out of the hell they lived in, a hope that was often dashed. The underlying question here is, did Belgian women see the Germans as occupiers and enemies? From Swelden's interviews, it seems not. Rather, on the contrary, perhaps with a bit of naivety, they simply perceived them as young and handsome men, charming in their uniforms and courteous, unlike the Belgians who tended to be rougher and less generous. Born of mystery, the case of the ABBA singer and the experiment in Norway Annie Fried Lyngstad, or Frida, was born on November 15, 1945, 6 months after the end of World War II, when the Third Reich's forces capitulated across Europe, and their troops fled from Norway after 5 years of occupation. Cindy Lyngstad was left alone with her mother. She was single, 3 months pregnant, and beginning to endure the contempt of the entire village of Balingen. To the neighbors, Cindy and other thousands of peasant girls were considered prostitutes and traitors to the nation. But she had only fallen in love with Alfred Haas, a Wehrmacht soldier, when she was 16 years old. And now that the war was over, she carried the fruit of a reproduction program for the improvement of the Aryan race known as Lebensborn. This program was created by Schutzstaffel SS leader Heinrich Himmler to biologically expand Nazi ideology, encouraging soldiers to have Aryan children with racially fit women, not only in Germany, but also in occupied territories like the Norwegian village of Ballangen, where Cindy Lyngstad's daughter was born. Her mother plunged into absolute poverty and repudiated in her own country, baptized her as Annie Fried Lyngstad, but she later became known as Frida, the singer of ABBA, the legacy of Frida, the story of the ABBA singer and her connection to Nazi heritage. Annie Fried Lyngstad's mother suffered a calvary that lasted at least 2 years. In the village, it was rumored that she had gotten pregnant in exchange for a bag of potatoes, but she truly loved Hasse, a young and handsome German soldier who had suddenly disappeared at the end of the war and of whom she never heard again. After the capitulation, the post-war hatred towards the descendants of German soldiers was so great that Norwegian government psychologists responsible for reporting on the children and their single mothers concluded that women who had fraternized with Germans were of limited talent, and as social psychopaths, some of them seriously backward, just like Frida. At least 12,000 children were born in Norway under the Lebensborn plan, but the program was cut short with the Nazis' fall. Beyond the fact that thousands of them were interned in psychiatric institutions, most were expelled from the country with their families, decimated and accused of having begotten future monsters who could resurrect Nazism. After 2 years of siege and discrimination, Zinni Lyngstad, her mother Arntine, and little Frida, or the German bastard as she was called in the village, immigrated to Sweden to start a new life far from the indelible stigma of the Lebensborn program. Settled near Stockholm, Frida's mother died a few months later, partly from kidney failure, but mostly from the sadness of having to raise a child alone without resources or state support. Frida was left in the care of her grandmother Arntine, a seamstress and promoter of the girl's meteoric artistic career. Frida had a broad solo career that began before ABBA and continued long after the Swedish group disbanded. In Stockholm, her grandmother did everything possible to see her granddaughter happy and supported her dream of being a singer. With her meager income as a seamstress, she managed to buy a piano in installments to continue developing the girl's musical talent. Acclaimed in all the venues where she performed, when Frida was 16 years old, everything seemed on track. The past was far behind, her voice was enchanting, and the way she moved on stage without any shyness opened the doors of TV musical contests and record labels like EMI. Frida believed her father had died in a shipwreck and had never heard of the Nazi reproduction program Lebensborn until, during the early days of her relationship with Benny Andersson and ABBA's success, a German fan revealed a disturbing revelation. Her father was alive. The former soldier was married and had 2 other children. It was then that Anderson arranged a meeting between Frida and her father, Alfred Haas, the former Nazi soldier who now worked as a pastry chef. Annie Fried was shocked to learn her father was alive and that she would see him for the first time. The meeting, however, was cold and somewhat overacted. Frida was famous, and the magazines wanted to tell everything in great detail, like the Dutch magazine Pop Photo or the German Bravo, which had given the scoop, telling the true story of the dark-haired ABBA singer. However, over time, the meeting proved to be a setup, and Frida fell into deep depression. She had 2 children from her first marriage who kept her afloat, but her relationship with Benny Anderson, her second partner, was failing. She met her biological father a few more times, and then never saw him again. "I can't love him as if he had been with us while I was growing up," Frida said. Her father died on February 23, 2009. Frida struggled to leave behind her painful past and has never spoken about it again. In 1981, she divorced Benny Anderson and married Prince Heinrich Russo-Reuss von Plauen, a member of the German royal family. Her marriage to Prince Reuss opened the doors of the Swedish royal court. Since then, the Norwegian girl conceived under a Nazi experiment to create a superior race, an orphan who suffered exile and rejection from her village, now holds the title of Her Serene Highness Princess Annie Fried Reuss, Countess of Plauen. Mothers of German children, between protection and social marginalization. German soldiers were subjected to strict discipline, as Nazism also wanted to control their intimate lives. Condoms were distributed as a method of preventing sexually transmitted diseases, and the regime established brothels in occupied countries to satisfy soldiers' sexual needs. However, this was not enough. In fact, many relationships with local women were born as a kind of rebellion by young soldiers. The war also triggered this new need to seek refuge in more intense feelings, imbued with tenderness to escape the horrors and destruction experienced every day. In Norway, the belief that German children suffered from mental disorders existed for a long time. The famous psychiatrist Ernulf Udegård, who treated women who fraternized with the German enemy during Norway's occupation, quantified that between 50% and 60% of children born to 35 Norwegian mothers and German fathers were diagnosed with cognitive problems. Especially due to prejudice and aversion against the German enemy, many of them were interned in psychiatric institutions, treated as incapable of understanding, and abandoned there to their fate. In Amsterdam, there were special hospitals where German lovers could give birth on the condition that they join the National Socialist Women's Association. According to Nazi ideology, the children of Belgian and Dutch women could be good Aryans. These women were allowed to choose between giving their children up for adoption or keeping them. In Eastern Europe, women had no choice. It was the Nazis who made the decision. If the German soldier's child had enough Aryan characteristics, he could keep it. If not considered suitable, it was given up for adoption. In Dutch hospitals, women who loved a German did not always receive good treatment. For example, it happened that above the bed of one of these girls there was a sign that said, "It is mandatory to wash your hands after caring for the pregnant woman." Only a few men married Dutch lovers. Many women remained single mothers. Those who could keep their children with them often returned to their country of origin, working hard through sacrifices and privations to feed those desired and unfortunate children and allow them a dignified life. Sint Hubertus in Amsterdam was an institution that sheltered single mothers and their German children. After the war, this association took a clear stance on the inclusion of children of German soldiers. They could only be accepted if their status was kept secret and if the German name was converted to Dutch. In her research, Monica Durix found many examples of name changes for forbidden children. In many cases, even when a father wanted to recognize his child, he was not allowed to register it with his paternal surname. Children of the enemy were seen as forbidden children, uncomfortable witnesses to a phenomenon that wanted to be erased from national memory. As illegitimate children, they could not enjoy the same rights as children born within marriage, but not even within the same families did they receive the same treatment. Children of shame grew up in pain, in the denial of their roots, often unloved by their own mothers, frequently humiliated in public, discriminated against, and isolated. A journalist recounts the dramatic testimony of one of them, a doctor who spent his childhood in constant shame for faults that were not his. His maternal grandmother, in fact, detested that Nazi son who dishonored her and the whole family and repeatedly punished him with painful and humiliating practices, provoking the laughter of the whole community that continuously insulted and mocked him. In Germany, before the enactment of the 1969 law on the legal status of children born out of wedlock, illegitimate children were entirely excluded from the father's natural inheritance, as they were not considered his descendants. After the law came into force in 1970, this right was recognized for natural children, but not for those born before 1949, who were already 21 years old at the time the law came into force. This inheritance right is often why biological relatives refused to meet the children of war. On the one hand, relatives feared they would claim inheritance rights, and on the other hand, the children only wanted to be recognized as such and reclaim their denied origins and identity. Reunion with the past, family union, through the search for German fathers. Many years after the end of World War II, children of shame decided to reveal their identities, began to tell their stories, and search for that German father they had often never known. This is the case of Dorothee Hoffmann, who in 2005, after the publication in Le Figaro of Jean-Paul Picaper's book Cursed Children, founded the association Heart Without Borders in France. The association, which has about 200 members, brings together all the children born to French mothers and German soldiers, offering concrete help to rediscover their origins and obtain dual citizenship from the National Assembly or the Bundestag. The reference point for this research is the German office in Berlin, an archive created in 1939 that contains all the files of German soldiers involved in various capacities in World War II. Each year, the service handles around 500 requests from children of war seeking their German origins. The association's secretary, Chantal Lecalec, is herself a child of shame. "Without roots, it's like living halfway," she said in an interview. "I finally got to tell my story, but I already lived my life. I did it too late. But even if it's too late for us, we're here to help others, those being born now. We're here so they don't feel alone, so they don't have to suffer what we suffered. A childhood without love is an abyss of loneliness that takes years to get out of. The object of elimination from collective memory. The object of elimination from the collective memory of post-war Europe was the love stories between German soldiers and women from occupied countries. In fact, the dominant rhetoric at the end of the conflict was one that prescribed women to return to their family roles and procreative and maternal duties. Many of the facts involving women prosecuted for collaboration relate to romantic and sexual relationships, which are intimately intertwined with wartime events. During liberation, women were punished for not conforming to the dominant model of demanding loyalty to the nation, their husbands and boyfriends. Sexual relations with the enemy were not only judged as betrayals, but demonstrated enjoyment of autonomous and independent freedom and sexuality that was impossible to leave unpunished. For having betrayed the nation, women were shaved in public so their guilt would be immediately visible, stripped, beaten, insulted, subjected to mockery and humiliation, while the sad spectacle was experienced by the population as if it were a party. Among the various motivations that pushed women into the arms and beds of the enemies during the war, the simplest and most banal has been attempted to be eliminated and erased. Love. Some relationships between German soldiers and local women were love relationships. Reckless, naive, superficial, wrong, immature, dangerous, dramatic, long, or fleeting. These love stories have been forgotten by chronicles and historiography, just as the children of shame born from these relationships have been attempted to be forgotten. For those children, childhood was often dramatic, with strong psychological repercussions that continued into adulthood. Some were abandoned in orphanages and institutions. Others lived in families that continued to see in them the ignominious mark of shame and illegitimacy. Some mothers found themselves raising their children alone amid 1,000 difficulties, amid distrust and scorn for having been enemy lovers and traitors to the homeland. Despite the attempt to erase this dark page of the liberation from national memory, the stories of witnesses who were children of war have begun to emerge and reclaim their identity, freeing themselves from the shame and guilt they never had. A complex and diversified phenomenon that spread throughout Europe during World War II, with markedly misogynistic roots that push us, also in light of the new social changes we are experiencing, to reflect on the condition of women and the discrimination that, especially in times of strong crisis, affect the female gender. The cruel punishment of head shaving, applied to women accused of horizontal collaboration, represents one of the darkest chapters of liberation. These women, guilty only of having lived relationships during wartime, whether born of love, necessity, or survival, became scapegoats for collective frustration and humiliation. Their children, innocent victims of a war they never chose, carried the burden of social stigma throughout their lives. Many grew up without knowing their origins. Others discovered the truth only in adulthood, and all faced discrimination that marked their existence. The testimonies collected over the decades reveal stories of suffering, but also of resilience. Women like Monica Dirks, Galinda Sweldens, and Annie Frid Lingstad have courageously broken the silence, giving voice to thousands of forgotten stories. Their accounts remind us that behind every historical event, there are individual human stories, often more complex and nuanced than official narratives would have us believe. The enemy could be cruel and murderous, but also kind, charming, and capable of inspiring genuine feelings. These love stories, forbidden and marginalized, challenge our understanding of war and its consequences. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and about how societies deal with trauma and guilt. The phenomenon of children born from relationships between occupiers and occupied women was not limited to a single country, but extended throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. Each nation dealt with this legacy differently, but the common element was the marginalization and stigmatization of these children and their mothers. Organizations like Heart Without Borders in France and similar initiatives in other countries have worked to help these children find their roots and reclaim their identity. The search for German fathers has often been a journey of self-discovery and healing for people who lived their entire lives with an incomplete sense of identity. The legal and bureaucratic obstacles these children faced were enormous. From inheritance rights to simple recognition of paternity, every aspect of their existence was complicated by their forbidden origins. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Growing up with the knowledge or suspicion of being a child of the enemy left deep scars. Many suffered from identity crises, feelings of unworthiness, and difficulty forming relationships. Yet these stories also speak of extraordinary resilience. Despite facing rejection, discrimination, and often poverty, many of these children managed to build successful lives. Some, like Frida from ABBA, achieved international fame, while others found fulfillment in quieter ways. The transformation of these stories from sources of shame to subjects of historical study and public recognition represents an important evolution in how we understand the past. No longer hidden in the shadows, these narratives contribute to a more complete and honest picture of wartime experience. The courage shown by those who have shared their stories has paved the way for others to come forward. Each testimony adds another piece to the puzzle of understanding how war affects not just soldiers and political leaders, but ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Today, as we face new conflicts and population movements around the world, these historical lessons remain relevant. They remind us of the lasting consequences of war on the most vulnerable, particularly women and children, and the importance of protecting human dignity even in the darkest times. The legacy of these wartime relationships and their offspring challenges us to think more deeply about themes of identity, belonging, and forgiveness. It asks us to consider how societies can better support those who find themselves on the margins due to circumstances beyond their control. As the last survivors of this era pass away, the importance of preserving these testimonies becomes even greater. They serve as powerful reminders of the human cost of war and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. The stories of horizontal collaboration and its aftermath ultimately speak to universal themes: the search for love and acceptance, the struggle for identity, and the quest for justice and recognition. They remind us that history is not just about nations and armies, but about individual human beings trying to survive and find meaning in impossible circumstances.